The courthouse ledgers were never meant to be read, stacked in a forgotten basement of the old Richmond County administrative building. These leather-bound volumes had survived fires, floods, and decades of willful neglect. When the Preservation Society began digitizing historical documents in 2009, an intern named Rebecca Chen noticed something peculiar in a plantation transfer log from 1847. The same woman's name appeared 5 times across 5 different properties. Within just 7 years, each entry was accompanied by a notation that made the historian pause and reach for her supervisor. With newborn child, the discovery would unravel one of the most disturbing patterns ever documented in antebellum property records. 5 plantations, 5 births, 5 sales, all within 7 years, all involving the same woman. The mathematical precision was chilling, the implications darker still, but to understand what those ledgers truly revealed, what they documented in cold numbers and clinical language, we need to go back to where it all began, to a woman whose story was written not in diaries or letters, but in transaction receipts, birth records, and the merciless arithmetic of human commerce. Before we continue with the story of Martha and the 5 plantations that became her prison, make sure you're subscribed to our channel and hit that notification bell so you never miss stories like this. And tell us in the comments, what state are you watching from? Let's discover together what these records revealed. What the Preservation Society found wasn't just one woman's tragedy. It was evidence of a system, a pattern, a machinery of exploitation so methodical it left a paper trail that nobody thought would ever be examined. Martha arrived at Riverside Plantation on a humid Tuesday morning in April 1840. She was 19 years old, purchased at auction in Charleston for $800, a considerable sum that reflected not just her youth and health, but something more valuable and dangerous: documented literacy. The bill of sale preserved in the Charleston Municipal Archives listed her skills: reading, writing, arithmetic, needlework, cooking. In an era when teaching enslaved people to read was illegal in many southern states, Martha's literacy made her simultaneously valuable and threatening. The auction had been held in a brick warehouse near the harbor, where the smell of salt water mixed with sweat and fear. Martha had stood on a wooden platform while men in fine coats examined her teeth, her hands, her posture. They asked her to read passages from the Charleston Courier. She complied, her voice steady, her eyes focused on the words and not on the faces watching her. When the bidding reached $800, William Hargrove raised his hand one final time and Martha became his property. Riverside sprawled across 1,200 acres of fertile farmland along the Savannah River just north of the Georgia border. The main house was a 3-story Georgian structure with white columns that could be seen from the river, a statement of wealth and power visible to anyone passing by. Behind the house, neat rows of cotton fields stretched toward the pine forests that marked the property line. Closer to the main house stood the dependencies: a kitchen house, a laundry house, storehouses, stables, and a line of small cabins where the enslaved workers lived. William Hargrove had inherited Riverside from his father in 1837, along with 63 enslaved people and considerable debt. At 32, he was determined to restore the plantation's profitability through what he called modern management practice. He kept meticulous ledgers documenting every bale of cotton, every pound of seed, every dollar spent and earned. He also kept detailed records of his human property: names, ages, skills, purchases, sales, births, and deaths, all recorded in neat columns of black ink. Riverside's ledger recorded Martha's arrival with typical brevity. April 14, 1840. Martha, female, age 19, purchased Charleston auction, cost $800, skills literate, household work, assigned main house under supervision Mrs. Hargrove. The main house staff consisted of 9 people, a cook, 2 kitchen help, 3 house servants, 2 laundry workers, and a stable boy who also tended the garden. Martha was assigned to work under the direct supervision of Elenina Hargrove Williams, a thin woman of 30, with perpetually pursed lips and a reputation for pious severity. Mrs. Hargrove ran the household with military precision, insisting on absolute silence during meals, immediate obedience to all commands and visible gratitude for the Christian charity of being housed, fed, and clothed. Martha's day began before sunrise. She rose in the pre-dawn darkness, dressed in the rough cotton dress and apron that constituted her uniform, and hurried to the main house to light fires in the bedrooms and parlor. By the time the Harrow family woke, the house needed to be warm, water needed to be heated, and breakfast needed to be in preparation. Her mornings were spent cleaning bedrooms, making beds with hospital corners that Mrs. Harrow would inspect with a ruler, dusting furniture and polishing silver. Afternoons meant laundry, heating water, scrubbing linens on washboards, hanging everything to dry, ironing with heavy flat irons heated on the stove. Evenings meant serving dinner, cleaning the dining room and kitchen, and preparing the house for night. She rarely finished before 9 or 10, and then she had to walk back to her cabin in the quarters, exhausted, to collapse on her pallet until the cycle began again before dawn. The work was relentless, but Martha endured. She had learned survival early: never meet their eyes directly, but never appear defiant. Move quickly, but not frantically. Speak only when spoken to. Anticipate needs before they're voiced. Become invisible except when needed. She made no friends among the other house servants at first, understanding that closeness meant vulnerability. She observed, learned the rhythms of the household, and tried to make herself as valuable and unremarkable as possible. The other house servants slowly began to accept her presence. There was Denina, the head cook, a woman in her 52nd whose skill with elaborate meals had made Riverside famous among the local planter class. There was Esther, 23, who worked in the kitchen and had 2 small children in the quarters. There was Clara, 16, nervous and quick, who had been assigned to laundry work after proving too clumsy to serve at table. These women spoke to Martha in fragments, a warning about Mrs. Harrow's moods, advice about which tasks to prioritize, small gestures of solidarity that couldn't be fully expressed, but were understood. Nonetheless, 3 months after Martha's arrival in July, a new overseer arrived at Riverside. His name was Dutch Carmichael, a man of 35 with reddish hair and a face weathered by years of outdoor work. Hargrove had hired him from a plantation in South Carolina, lured by Carmichael's reputation for increasing productivity and maintaining discipline. Carmichael moved into the overseer's house, a small cottage near the stables, and began implementing new systems: earlier work hours, shortened meal breaks, stricter accounting of cotton picked, and immediate punishment for any perceived laziness. Within days, Carmichael began paying unusual attention to Martha. It started subtly. He would appear near the kitchen house when Martha was carrying water. He would watch her hang laundry, standing just within her peripheral vision. He began finding reasons to summon her for tasks, bringing messages to field workers, checking inventory and storage buildings, tasks that took her away from the main house and the watchful eyes of the other servants. The other women noticed immediately. Denina tried to keep Martha close to the kitchen. Esther warned her with her eyes when Carmichael approached. Clara whispered urgently one evening, "Don't go nowhere alone. Keep to where folks can see you." But there was nowhere truly safe, no authority to appeal to, no protection under any law. An enslaved woman had no legal right to refuse any command from any white person, and everyone knew it. In early August, Carmichael cornered Martha in the laundry house. It was late afternoon, the sun slanting through the windows creating harsh shadows. The other laundry workers had gone to prepare dinner. Martha was folding linens when she heard the door close and realized she was no longer alone. What happened in the laundry house that day was never recorded in any ledger or document. Martha never spoke of it to anyone, but the pattern it initiated would follow her across 5 plantations in 7 years. By October, Martha knew she was pregnant. She told no one, binding her midsection tightly with cloth strips to conceal the changes. She continued working, moving through her days with the same quiet efficiency, while terror and anger whirred inside her. She knew what pregnancy meant. She had seen it before, had heard the whispered stories among enslaved women about children born and sold away, about mothers separated from their babies, about the particular vulnerability of bearing a child whose father was a white man. By January 1841, concealment was impossible. Her body betrayed her despite the bindings. Mrs. Harrove noticed during a fitting for new household uniforms, her thin fingers suddenly gripping Martha's arm with surprising strength. "You're with child," Mrs. Hargrove said, her voice flat. It wasn't a question. Martha said nothing. What could she say? That evening, Mrs. Hargrove reported the situation to her husband in his study. William Hargrove listened, his face unreadable, and then summoned Dutch Carmichael. The conversation in Hargrove study lasted 17 minutes. The house servants working in the adjacent rooms heard raised voices but couldn't make out words. Carmichael emerged with his face red, jaw clenched, and walked directly to the overseer's cottage without speaking to anyone. 3 days later, Carmichael was dismissed from Riverside. The ledger noted January 19, 1841. Terminated Dutch Carmichael, overseer, cause violation of household policy, paid final wages $47. The same day, Martha was moved from the main house to a cabin at the very edge of the quarter, as far from the main house as possible, while still being on plantation grounds. It was a small cabin previously used for storage with a dirt floor, a single window, and a fireplace that smoked badly. She was given a straw mattress, 2 blankets, and orders to remain there until after the birth. For the next 4 months, Martha lived in near isolation. Esther brought her meals twice a day: cornbread, buttermilk, occasionally a bit of salt, pork, or greens. She was not permitted to attend the evening prayer services or the rare Sunday gatherings. She was not given any work assignments. She existed in a strange limbo, neither fully part of the plantation community nor completely separate from it. The isolation gave Martha time to think, to grieve, to prepare. She thought about her own mother, sold away when Martha was 7 years old. She thought about the future growing inside her body, a child she hadn't chosen but would love nonetheless. She thought about escape. The forests were close, and she knew stories of people who had run north, but she also knew the reality. Bloodhounds, slave patrols, the brutal punishments for those caught attempting to flee. On May 3, 1841, Martha went into labor. The birth was attended by Aunt Sarah, elderly enslaved woman who served as midwife for the plantation. The labor lasted 14 hours in the windowless cabin. Lit only by a single candle and the fireplace, Martha brought her daughter into the world as spring rain droomed on the roof. The plantation birth record preserved in the Riverside Ledger listed May 3, 1841. Infant girl born to Martha, house servant. Child healthy, Itaprox 7, lbs. Mother Ricard from delivery. Father unknown. Martha named her daughter Sarah after the midwife who had stayed with her through the long night. The name was never entered into any official record. For 6 precious weeks, Martha remained in the cabin with her daughter. She held Sarah, nursed her, sang to her in whispers, memorized every detail of her tiny face. These were the only 6 weeks in Sarah's life when she would know her mother's undivided attention, when Martha could simply be her mother without the crushing weight of slavery determining every moment. Then, on a humid morning in late June, William Harrove appeared at Martha's cabin accompanied by a man she had never seen before. The man wore a fine coat despite the heat and carried a leather satchel bulging with papers. This was Vernon Hughes, a slave trader who operated between Charleston and Augusta, buying and selling human beings with the casual efficiency of someone trading livestock. They stood outside the cabin for several minutes. Martha inside with Sarah could see them through the window. Harrove gesturing, Hughes examining papers, nodding, occasionally glancing toward the cabin door. The transaction was being finalized with Martha only feet away, as if she were not a person with thoughts and feelings, but simply merchandise being transferred between owners. Finally, Harrove knocked on the cabin door. Martha opened it, holding Sarah close. "Martha," Hargrove said, his voice businesslike, "you and the child have been sold. Mr. Hughes here will be transporting you to a new situation. You have 30 minutes to gather your belongings." The Plantation Ledger recorded June 28, 1841. Sale of Martha, age 20, and infant. daughter to Hughes Trading Company, Charleston. Sale price $750. Reason for sale: disciplinary reassignment. Proceeds applied to estate operating fund. Martha was given exactly 30 minutes. She wrapped Sarah in the cleanest cloth. She had gathered her a few possessions: a comb, a spare dress, a small wooden cross Esther had secretly given her, and stepped out of the cabin. Esther and Dinah stood in the distance, not speaking, not approaching, but bearing witness. Their faces said what? Their voices couldn't. "I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. God with you." Martha climbed into the back of Vernon Hughes's wagon. 3 other enslaved people were already there. 2 men and a woman, all looking stunned, all recently purchased from nearby estates. The wagon pulled away from Riverside, its wheels crunching on the gravel drive. Martha looked back once at the plantation that had been her home for 14 months. She saw the white columns of the main house gleaming in the morning sun. She saw the fields where men and women were already at work in the cotton. She saw the quarters where she had lived those first months, and the isolated cabin where she had given birth. She would never see Riverside again, but in a terrible sense she would never leave it either. What had happened there, the attention, the violence, the pregnancy, the birth, the sale, would become the pattern that would define the next 7 years of her life. As the wagon jolted northward, Sarah slept in Martha's arms, unaware that her birth had just cost her mother everything, unaware that they were both about to become pieces in a cruel game that would be played out across 5 plantations in 4 states. This was only the beginning of Martha's journey. The first plantation had set the pattern. 4 more awaited her, each one following the same terrible script. The courthouse ledgers would document every transaction with perfect precision, but they would never record the human cost. The wagon ride from Riverside to Fairmont Estate lasted 3 days and covered nearly 90 meters. Through the pine forests and red clay hills of Georgia, Vernon Hughes was an efficient man who operated on tight schedules and narrow profit margins. He stopped only when necessary, brief rests to water the horses, quick purchases of cornbread and salted meat for his cargo, overnight stays at roadside taverns where the enslaved people were locked in storage sheds while Hughes slept in a bed. Martha learned during this journey that she and the others were not being transported to a specific buyer. They were stock. Hughes would stop at plantations along his route, presenting his merchandise to potential purchasers, negotiating prices and making sales as opportunities arose. It was a horrible arithmetic. Hughes had purchased Martha and Sarah for $750 from Harrow, and he needed to sell them for more than that to turn a profit. Every day of food and lodging ate into his margins. On the 3rd day, Hughes' wagon turned up a long oak-lined drive toward a substantial house. This was Fairmont Estate, a tobacco plantation in central Georgia, owned by brothers Charles and Edmund Beaumont. The property had been in the Beaumont family for 2 generations, though recent poor harvests and falling tobacco prices had forced them to operate with fewer workers and tighter budgets than their father had enjoyed. Hughes had a prearranged meeting with Charles Beaumont, who had sent word through a local trader that he was interested in purchasing a literate female servant. When the wagon arrived, Charles Beaumont emerged from the house, a portly man of 50 with thinning hair and an air of perpetual worry. His younger brother, Edmund, appeared from the tobacco barn, wiping his hands on his trousers. The negotiation took place in the front yard of the main house, with Martha standing nearby, holding 8-week-old Sarah. Hughes presented Martha's documentation, proof of purchase from Riverside, notation of her literacy and household skills, assurances of her health and temperament. Charles Beaumont asked Martha to read aloud from a tobacco buyer's circular. She complied, her voice steady despite her exhaustion. From 3 days of travel, the price discussion lasted 20 minutes. Hughes wanted $8.50, a $100 markup. Charles argued that a woman, while an infant, was less valuable than a single woman, that the child would be a drain on resources for years before being old enough to work, that times were difficult, and he couldn't afford extravagance. They settled on $650. The Fairmont Ledger recorded Martha's arrival July 2, 1841. Purchased 1 female Negro. Martha, age 20, with infant daughter approx 8 weeks old. Previous owner, Riverside Plantation via Hughes Trading Co. Purchase price $650 lawn. Skills documented: reading, writing, household, service, assignment, field work, tobacco cultivation, field work. The two words hit Martha like a physical blow. At Riverside, despite everything, she had been house staff. Hard work, certainly, but sheltered from the worst of the weather, with slightly better food and clothing than field workers. Field work meant the gangs, the sun, the overseers. Whip, the brutal pace of planting and harvesting, and with an infant daughter to care for. Charles Beaumont noticed Martha's reaction and misinterpreted it. "You'll do as you're told," he said sharply. "Your literacy don't exempt you from honest work. You'll join the tobacco gangs starting tomorrow morning." Fairmont was different from Riverside in almost every way. The plantation was smaller, 600 acres under cultivation, but worked by nearly 80 enslaved people. The quarters were more crowded, with families packed into small cabins, sometimes two families sharing a single room. The work was harder, the food more meager, the supervision more brutal. Martha was assigned to a cabin with two other women: Patience, a field worker in her 42nd who had lost 3 children to sale, and Ruth, a young woman of 22 with twin boys who were 4 years old. The cabin was perhaps 12 feet by 14 feet with a dirt floor, one small window, and a fireplace that all 3 women shared for cooking and heat. Privacy was impossible. Sleep was difficult. The twin boys cried at night. Sarah cried at different times, and all 3 women had to rise before dawn for their work assignments. Tobacco cultivation demanded different labor than cotton. The plants required constant attention, transplanting seedlings, removing tobacco worms by hand, suckering the plants to promote leaf growth, harvesting at precisely the right moment of ripeness, hanging the leaves in drying barn where the heat could reach 130 degrees Fahrenheit. The work was detailed, repetitive, and exhausting. Martha worked with Sarah bound to her chest in a cloth sling, an arrangement that made every movement more difficult. When Sarah cried from hunger, Martha had to stop her work to nurse her, drawing angry looks from the overseer. When rain came, there was no shelter. The work continued with everyone soaked to the skin. When the sun blazed, there was minimal water and no shade. Martha learned to work through exhaustion, to push past pain, to keep moving because stopping meant punishment. Charles Beaumont was often absent from Fairmont, occupied with tobacco sales in Augusta, and Savannah with social obligations in the nearby town of Milledgeville, with the constant financial juggling required to keep a struggling plantation afloat. Day-to-day management fell to his younger brother Edmund, who lived in a small house on the property and served as de facto overseer. Edmund Beaumont was 42 years old and had never married. He was a man of variable moods, sometimes jovial and permissive, allowing longer meal breaks and lighter work quotas, sometimes volatile and cruel, erupting in sudden rages over minor infractions. The enslaved workers learned to read his moods by his gait and his drinking. When he walked with loose confidence, the day would be tolerable. When he walked with tense purpose and smelled of whiskey, everyone became cautious. Within 2 weeks of Martha's arrival, Edmund began singling her out. At first, it was ostensibly about her literacy. He would summon her to the plantation office, a small building near the tobacco barn where records were kept and supplies stored, and have her read passages from agricultural journals and tobacco market reports aloud. He would sit at his desk following along, asking her to repeat phrases, claiming he needed help understanding the language. Martha realized quickly that Edmund was barely literate himself. He could read simple text slowly, but anything complex left him struggling. Her reading sessions became a regular occurrence, 3 or 4 times a week, always in the late afternoon or early evening, always when the day's work was finished and most people had returned to the quarters. The sessions began innocently enough, but gradually Edmund's attention became more personal. He began asking Martha questions about her past, about Riverside, about how she had learned to read. He began commenting on her appearance, remarking that fieldwork was too harsh for someone refined. He began touching her shoulder when he leaned over to point a text, letting his hand linger. Patience noticed when Martha returned from these Sessions, her face carefully neutral. "That man's trouble," she said quietly one evening as they prepared their meager dinner. "Edmund been like this long as I been here. You mind yourself?" But there was no way to mind herself that mattered. Martha had no power to refuse Edmund's summons, no ability to avoid being alone with him, no recourse if he decided to exercise the absolute power he held over her. She could only endure, the way she had learned to endure everything else. By late October, Edmund's intentions had become explicit. The reading sessions had become pretenses for something else entirely. Martha would emerge from the office later and later, her jaw clenched, her eyes distant. She said nothing to anyone, because there was nothing to say. The other women understood without words. By early December 1841, Martha realized she was pregnant again. The realization came with a sense of crushing inevitability. She had been at Fairmont for only 5 months. Sarah was just 7 months old. And now another child was coming, conceived in violence, destined to complicate her life even further in a system that saw children as both economic assets and burdens, depending on who othered them. This time Martha didn't try to hide the pregnancy. What would be the point? By March 1842, when her condition became obvious to everyone, she simply continued working, her body straining under the dual burden of pregnancy and labor. She worked in the tobacco fields until she was 8 months pregnant, until the overseer who supervised the gangs, Edmund, had hired a man named Foster to handle direct field supervision. Finally moved her to lighter work, hauling water, cooking for the field gangs, cleaning the tobacco barn. In late May, Charles Beaumont returned from an extended trip to Savannah. Within 2 days, word reached him about Martha's pregnancy. The plantation was small enough that rumors traveled quickly, and this particular rumor that Edmund had gotten the new, literate servant pregnant was too juicy to remain contained. Charles confronted his brother in the main house. The servants working nearby heard their voices rising, heard Charles's anger and Edmund's defensive protests. The argument lasted more than an hour and ended with Charles storming out and Edmund disappearing into his cottage, where he remained for 2 days. On June 12, 1842, Martha went into labor. This birth was attended by patients who had experience with childbirth and served as informal midwife for the plantations. When the labor was shorter than with Sarah, 9 hours, but more difficult. Martha was exhausted from months of field work while pregnant, malnourished on the inadequate rations provided to enslaved workers, and psychologically shattered by the repetition of trauma. When the baby, a boy, finally emerged just after midnight, Martha held him and wept. She wept for him, for Sarah, for herself, for the impossibility of their situation. She named him Daniel, a name meaning God is my judge, though she barely believed in a God that would allow such suffering. The Fairmont birth record noted June 12, 1842. Male infant born to Martha, field worker. Child healthy, widow, approx 6 lbs. Mother survived difficult labor. Father unknown. The word unknown was a legal fiction everyone understood. Everyone knew who had fathered Daniel, but acknowledging it officially would create complications, questions of inheritance, of status, of scandal. Better to leave it officially unknown and handle the problem privately. The problem was handled 6 weeks later. On August 1st, 1842, a slave trader named Foster arrived at Fairmont Estate. He was a younger man, perhaps 30, who operated out of Augusta and specialized in quick turnovers, buying enslaved people cheaply and reselling them rapidly for modest profits. He arrived in the afternoon, spent an hour in conversation with Charles Beaumont, and left with a bill of sale. The Fairmont Ledger recorded August 3, 1842, sale of Martha, age 21, and 2 infant children to Foster and Sons. Trading, Augusta. Sale price $700. Reason, reduction of unnecessary estate obligations. Proceeds applied to operational expenses. Martha was given 1 hour to prepare. She gathered Sarah, now 15 months old, gathered Daniel, 7 weeks old, wrapped them both in what cloth she had, and prepared to leave. Patience helped her pack, moving silently, her face wet with tears she didn't bother to hide. "You got strength, patience," whispered as they embraced goodbye. "More strength than anyone should need, you remember that. You got strength, and these babies got you." Martha climbed into Foster's wagon with her 2 children as they pulled away from Fairmont Estate. She saw Edmund Beaumont watching from the window of his cottage. His face was expressionless. She had been at Fairmont for 13 months. She was leaving with 2 children and a sale price $75 lower than what she'd been purchased for just over a year earlier. The pattern was becoming clear, even if Martha didn't yet fully understand its implication. 2 plantations, 2 pregnancies, 2 sales, and 3 more plantations still to come. Foster's territory covered eastern Georgia and the western edge of South Carolina, a circuit he traveled regularly, buying enslaved people from struggling plantations and reselling them to more prosperous operations. His business model depended on volume and speed, quick purchases, quick sales, minimal investment in food and lodging for his stock. Martha and her children spent 2 weeks with Foster, first at his holding facility in Augusta, a warehouse near the river where enslaved people awaited sale, and then on a wagon journey northward. During those 2 weeks, Martha saw the machinery of the domestic slave trade up close. People arrived at the warehouse daily, processed like inventory, cataloged by age, sex, skills, and health. Families were routinely separated. Husbands sold to one buyer, wives to another, children divided among multiple purchases. The crying was constant, the desperation palpable, the cruelty casual. Martha kept Sarah and Daniel close every moment, terrified that Foster might decide it was more profitable to sell them separately. A literate woman might fetch a decent price, and children could be sold for future potential. But Foster seemed to recognize that Martha's value was increased by keeping the family together. A complete unit was easier to sell to certain types of buyers who preferred not to break up families, at least not visibly. On August 18, 1842, Foster's wagon climbed into the rolling hills of northern Georgia, approaching one of the largest and most prosperous plantations in the region. Oakwood Plantation sat on prime cotton growing land. Its 12,200 acres worked by nearly 200 enslaved people. The property belonged to the Prescott family. Robert Prescott, his wife Ella Lanner, and their 3 adult sons, Thomas, William, and James. The Prescott family represented old money and old power. Robert Prescott's grandfather had received a colonial land grant in the 1760s, and 3 generations had built Oakwood into a cotton empire. They were respected in the region, known for their public piety, their regular attendance at the Presbyterian Church, their contribution to local charities for white recipients, and their reputation as good slaveholders, which meant they rarely separated families, provided adequate food and clothing, and punished infractions with reasonable rather than extreme brutality. Foster had a standing relationship with Robert Prescott, who periodically purchased enslaved workers to replace those lost to disease, old age, or sale. When Foster's wagon arrived, Robert and his wife Ella emerged to inspect the available stock. Ella Prescott was a formidable woman of 55, tall and straight-backed, who took personal interest in managing the household and maintaining what she considered Christian standards of plantation operation. The negotiation over Martha happened largely between Foster and Robert Prescott, though Eleanor interjected frequently. Foster presented Martha's documentation, emphasizing her literacy and previous experience in household service, downplaying the fieldwork at Fairmont. Robert was interested in the literacy but concerned about the 2 young children. She'll be consumed with caring for infants, Robert observed. Limited productivity for years. Foster adjusted his price downward, $625 for all 3. Ella Prescott examined Martha directly, asking her to read from a Bible passage, testing her penmanship on a slate, asking about her experience with household management. Martha answered carefully, presenting herself as capable and compliant, knowing her life and her children's lives might depend on this performance. The sale was completed. The Oakwood records show August 18, 1842. Purchase of 1 female Martha, age 21, with 2 infant children, female approx 15 months, male approx 8 weeks. Previous owner, Foster and Sons Trading via Fairmont Estate. Purchase price $625. Skills, literate, household service, assignment, spinning house, general household support. Oakwood was unlike any place Martha had experienced. The scale was overwhelming. 200 people living in the quarters, main house with 12 rooms, cotton fields that seemed to stretch to the horizon. The organization was military in its precision. Every person had a specific role. Every day followed a strict schedule. Every activity was logged and monitored. Martha was assigned to the spinning house, a long, low building where cotton was processed into thread by a dozen enslaved women working spinning wheels. The work was tedious, but not physically brutal. Sitting at the wheel, maintaining steady rhythm, producing consistent thread. The environment was relatively sheltered from weather, though hot in summer and cold in winter. Most importantly, Eleanor Prescott had decreed that mothers with young children could keep their children nearby while working, as long as the children didn't disrupt productivity. Martha set up a corner of the spinning house with blankets for Sarah and Daniel. While she worked at her wheels, Sarah played quietly or slept, and Daniel spent most of his time either sleeping or nursing. The other women in the spinning house gradually accepted Martha's presence, sharing advice about managing children while working, offering occasional help when both babies cried simultaneously for 3 months. Life at Oakwood achieved a kind of stability Martha had never known. The work was demanding, but not impossible. She was reunited with household-type work rather than field labor. Her children were with her. The food rations were slightly more substantial than at Fairmont. A pea of cornmeal per week, a few pounds of salt, pork, occasionally vegetables from the kitchen garden. Eleanor Prescott insisted on rest from labor every Sunday, allowing time for washing clothes, tending small personal gardens. Some of the enslaved people were allowed to maintain and attending mandatory prayer services. The prayer services were held in a small building near the quarters, led by a white minister from the nearby town who came every Sunday afternoon to preach to the enslaved congregation. The sermons invariably focused on obedience, acceptance of one's station, and the promise of heavenly reward for earthly suffering. Martha sat through these services with her face carefully neutral, wondering what kind of God would create such a system and call it divine will. In late November, everything changed when James Prescott returned from university. James was the youngest of the 3 Prescott sons, 23 years old, recently completed 2 years of legal studies at the University of Virginia in Charlottesville. He was tall and handsome, with his mother's refined features and his father's commanding presence. He carried himself with the confidence of someone who had never been denied anything, who had never imagined that his desires might not be immediately gratified. He had returned to Oakwood full of ideas about plantation management, about modernization and efficiency, about implementing new systems he had read about in agricultural journals. His father indulged him, allowing James to tour the various operations, field, barns, processing buildings, and make observations and recommendations. James noticed Martha within his first week home. She was working at her spinning wheel when he entered the spinning house, with his father touring the facilities. James watched the women work, asked questions about productivity rates, examined the quality of thread being produced. His gaze lingered on Martha, her obvious literacy evident in the way she held herself, her careful attention to the quality of her work, her quiet competence. "This one," James said to his father, pointing at Martha. "She's literate, you said." Robert confirmed it, and James's interest was clearly piqued. Over the following days, he found reasons to visit the spinning house, frequently, always with questions, always watching Martha work with it. 2 weeks, James had persuaded his father to reassign Martha to assist with plantation records. The spinning house produced large quantities of thread that needed to be logged, measured, and tracked. Martha's literacy made her ideal for this task. She was given a desk in the small office attached to the spinning house and assigned to maintain daily production logs, recording the amount and quality of thread produced by each worker. The assignment seemed like a promotion, slightly less physically demanding work, an acknowledgement of her skills. But Martha felt immediate dread. The office was isolated, separate from the main spinning room where the Other women worked, and James Prescott found many reasons to spend time in that office. At first, his interest seemed genuinely focused on the work. He would review Martha's logs, asking detailed questions about productivity, having her read passages from agricultural journals about textile manufacturing, discussing ways to improve efficiency. Martha answered carefully, navigating the dangerous terrain between demonstrating competence and not appearing too intelligent, too independent. But gradually, inevitably, James' attention became personal. He began arriving in the office late in the afternoon after the other women had finished their shifts. He would sit close to Martha as she explained the log entries, his arm brushing against hers. He began making comments about her appearance, her voice, her intelligence, comments that made Martha's skin crawl even as she forced herself to accept them without visible reaction. By Christmas 1842, the pretense of professional interest had collapsed entirely. James's visits to the office became brazenly inappropriate. The door closed, his commands explicit. Martha had no recourse, no protection, no possibility of refusal. She was owned property. He was the owner's son. The arithmetic of power was absolute. She tried to avoid being alone, tried to time her work so she would leave before his afternoon visits, tried to bring her children with her as a deterrent. Nothing worked. James simply ordered her to return to the office, to leave the children with another woman to comply with his demands. By March 1843, Martha realized she was pregnant again, the third time in less than 3 years. This pregnancy was different from the start. Martha fell ill in her 4th month, developing a fever that lasted 4 weeks. She became too weak to work, confined to her cabin, her body struggling to sustain both herself and the pregnancy while fighting infection. Sarah, now 2 years old, tried to care for her younger brother Daniel, bringing Martha water, patting her face the way she had seen adults do when someone was sick. Eleanor Prescott, whether motivated by genuine concern or fear of losing valuable property, had Martha moved to a cabin near the main house where she could be more closely monitored. A doctor was summoned, Dr. Mitchell from the nearby town, an extraordinary expense for an enslaved person, but deemed necessary to protect the Prescott family's investment. Dr. Mitchell diagnosed Martha with severe pneumonia complicated by pregnancy. He prescribed quinine, bed rest, and nutritious food, luxuries rarely afforded to enslaved people. For 6 weeks, Martha hovered between life and death, her fever spiking and breaking, her body weakening, while Eleanor Prescott supervised her care with stern efficiency. Slowly, painfully, Martha recovered. By June, she was strong enough to sit up, to eat without assistance, to hold her children again. The pregnancy had survived, though Martha had lost considerable weight and remained weak. In September 1843, after a difficult 36-hour labor, Martha gave birth to another daughter. The birth was attended by Dr. Mitchell, another unprecedented expense because the previous illness had left everyone concerned about complications. The baby was born small but healthy, weighing perhaps 512 lb. The Oakwood birth record noted, September 12, 1843, female infant born to Martha, spinning house worker. Difficult delivery following mother's severe illness. Earlier in pregnancy, child exhibits initial weakness but responds well to treatment. Mother and infant both survived labor. Heavy blood loss. Mother required extended recovery. Father unknown. Martha named her daughter Rebecca. She chose the name because it meant to bind or to tie, and Martha felt bound to her children too. This impossible situation, to survival itself. The aftermath unfolded with what was becoming a familiar pattern. Someone, Martha never knew who, but suspected one of the house servants who had noticed James's frequent visits to the spinning house office, informed Robert Prescott about his son's involvement. The confrontation happened late one evening. The entire quarters could hear the shouting from the main house, Robert's voice thundering, James's voice defensive, Elenina's voice cutting through both with icy precision. The argument lasted more than an hour and ended with James leaving Oakwood the next morning, sent to manage a smaller Prescott property in South Carolina, effectively exiled from the family's primary estate. For 10 weeks after Rebecca's birth, Martha remained at Oakwood, recovering from the difficult delivery, caring for her 3 children. Sarah was 2.5 years old, beginning to talk in full sentences. Daniel was 16 months, just learning to walk. Rebecca was a newborn, who demanded constant attention. Martha allowed herself to hope just briefly that perhaps she might be allowed to stay at Oakwood, that perhaps the Prescotts would consider her service valuable enough to overlook her complicated history. Perhaps the pattern would finally break. Then on a cold morning in late November, a well-dressed slave trader named Ashworth arrived at Oakwood. He spent 2 hours in conversation with Robert Prescott, examining NG documents, negotiating terms. The Oakwood Ledger recorded November 23, 1843. Sale of Martha, age 22, and 3 children, ages 2 years, 6 months, 1 year, 4 months, 10 weeks to Ashworth. Acquisitions, Charleston. Sale price $650. Reason, reassignment of assets due to changing household needs. Proceeds applied to estate expansion fund. The price had gone up slightly, perhaps reflecting Martha's proven resilience, or perhaps because 3 children represented potential future labor. But Martha noticed what others might not. She was still worth less than the $800 she had originally been sold for, despite being in the prime of her working life. Arthur gathered her 3 children, her meager belongings, and prepared to leave for the 4th time as Ashworth's wagon rolled down the Oakline Drive. Leading away from Oakwood, Martha looked back at the plantation that had promised stability, but delivered only another iteration of the same pattern. 3 plantations, 3 pregnancies, 3 sales, and she was still only 22 years old. What Martha didn't yet fully understand was that each sale was making her less valuable. Each child was marking her as problematic. Each pregnancy was creating a documentary trail that would follow her through the ledgers and records of the domestic slave trade. She was being systematically devalued, turned from a premium servant into damaged goods, all because of crimes committed against her that she had no power to prevent. 2 more plantations awaited her. The pattern was not finished. Ashworth's territory covered a vast region from Charleston through Georgia and into Alabama, followed the profitable trade routes where cotton was king and enslaved labor was the foundation of wealth. He was a more sophisticated operator than Foster. Better dressed, more connections, higher-end clientele. He specialized in quality stock, enslaved people with skills, training, or other attributes that commanded premium prices from wealthy planters. Martha's situation was complicated. On one hand, her literacy and household skills made her theoretically valuable. On the other hand, 3 children under 3 years old made her immediately less appealing to most buyers, and her history, visible in the trail of sales and transfers that appeared on her documentation, raised questions that Ashworth had to carefully manage. The solution was to market Martha as a family unit to a very specific type of buyer. Wealthy planters who could afford to take on the short-term burden of young children in exchange for long-term labor value, and who prided themselves on their benevolence in not breaking up families. Ashworth transported Martha and her children to his main facility in Charleston, where they spent 3 weeks while he searched for the right buyer. The facility was a large brick building near the slave market, divided into cells where enslaved people awaited sale. Martha and her children were kept in a room with 8 other women and their children, all all trying not to think about what came next. Finally, in mid-December 1843, Ashworth secured a buyer, Jonathan Whitfield, owner of Cedar Hills Plantation in eastern Alabama, one of the wealthiest men in the territory. Cedar Hills was the largest property Martha had yet encountered. 1,800 acres of prime cotton land, nearly 300 enslaved workers, and a main house that looked like something from a storybook. Jonathan Whitfield had inherited the plantation from his father and expanded it through shrewd investments in land and cotton futures. At 54 years old, he was a widower. His wife had died in childbirth 8 years earlier, and managed his vast operation with meticulous attention to detail and an ironclad sense of order. Whitfield had specific requirements. He wanted a literate woman to assist with household correspondence and records. He was willing to accept children as part of the arrangement, provided they would eventually contribute to the plantation's labor force. Ashworth assured him that Martha fit these requirements perfectly. The sale was completed through correspondence with Ashworth, transporting Martha and her children westward to Alabama. The journey took a week, the longest distance Martha had yet traveled, carrying her further and further from the Carolinas and Georgia she had known. The Cedar Hills records show December 20th, 1843, purchase of one female Martha, age 22, with 3 young children, ages 2 years, 6 months, 1 year, 5 months, and 11 weeks. Prev. Ias. Owner Ashworth Acquisitions via Oakwood Plantation, Georgia. Purchase price $600. Skills, literacy correspondence, household service assignment, main house. Staff, children to be housed in nursery quarters. Special notation. Premium paid for literacy skills. Purchase approved by J. Whitfield personally. For the first time in her life, Martha was separated from her children. Cedar Hills was so large that different functions were strictly segregated. The main house staff lived in small rooms in an outbuilding behind the house. The field workers lived in the quarters A, 4 miles away, and children, 2 young to work, lived in the nursery quarters, a large building overseen by 3 elderly enslaved women who cared for dozens of children while their parents worked elsewhere on the plantation. Martha was assigned to a small room in the servants' building, just large enough for a narrow bed and a small trunk, while Sarah, Daniel, and Rebecca were taken to the nursery. She was allowed to visit them only on Sunday afternoons, and the separation was agonizing. Sarah, now almost 3 years old, didn't understand why Mama couldn't stay with them. She cried every time Martha had to leave, clinging to her skirts, begging her not to go. Daniel, 18 months old, would watch Martha leave with confused eyes, not old enough to understand, but old enough to feel abandoned. And Rebecca, just 3 months old, was nursing, which meant Martha had to express milk during the week and bring it to the nursery. Painful and humiliating process. Martha's work assignment was in the main house, a world of polish and propriety that seemed disconnected from the brutal reality of the plantation outside. She was responsible for cleaning the second-floor bedrooms, maintaining Jonathan Whitfield's private study, assisting with correspondence when he dictated letters, and serving a table when he entertained guests. Whitfield himself was a reserved man who rarely spoke directly to his servants except to give orders. He maintained a large household staff, 12 people who kept the house running with invisible efficiency, and he expected perfection. A speck of dust, a poorly folded napkin, a letter with imperfect penmanship could result in severe punishment, though Whitfield himself rarely administered it. Instead, he had overseers who handled discipline, maintaining the illusion that he was above such crude matters. The work was demanding, but Martha found a certain refuge in its predictability. The days followed strict routines. The expectations were clear. If she did her work perfectly and made herself invisible, she could exist in a kind of numb stasis, her only focus on surviving until Sunday, when she could see her children. But Cedar Hills had another presence that shattered any possibility of peace. Nathan Whitfield, Jonathan's son. Nathan was 21 years old, the only surviving child from Jonathan's marriage. He had been raised with every privilege wealth could provide and had grown into a young man who believed the world existed to serve his pleasures. He had been expelled from university in Virginia for gambling and drinking. He had been sent home in disgrace, and his father had made him assistant overseer as punishment and supposedly character-building exercise. Nathan handled his position with all the casual cruelty of someone who had never been denied anything and had no empathy for those beneath him in the social hierarchy. He drank heavily, gambled with the overseers and neighboring planters' sons, and treated the enslaved workers as objects for his entertainment or abuse. He noticed Martha within days of her arrival. Martha was carrying fresh linens to the second-floor bedrooms when Nathan stepped out of his room, clearly having just woken despite it being mid-afternoon. He watched her work with open interest, making comments about her appearance that made her skin crawl. When she tried to leave quickly, he blocked her path. "You're the new literate one, aren't you?" he said, his breath smelling of whiskey despite the early hour. "Father says you can read and write." How does a learn to read? Martha kept her eyes down. Yes, sir. I was taught when I was young, sir. Taught by who? Show me. Read this. He grabbed a book from a nearby table and thrust it at her. Martha read the passage he indicated, her voice steady, despite her racing heart. Nathan laughed. Well, I'll be damned. You actually can read. That's something. Father's got himself a clever one. He let her pee. Ass, but his eyes followed her as she left. The attention escalated. Quickly, Nathan began finding excuses to be wherever Martha was working. He would summon her to his room to tidy up, even though he had already been served. He would order her to read to him from books or newspapers, sitting too close, touching her under the pretense of pointing at text. The other house. Servants warned Martha with their eyes in careful silence. This was familiar territory. They had seen Nathan fix it on women before, had seen what happened when he decided he wanted something. Martha tried every strategy she knew to avoid him, working faster to finish before he appeared, staying in groups with other servants, being so invisible he might forget about her. Nothing worked. Nathan had decided he was interested, and in his world his interest was the only thing that mattered. By spring 1844, the inevitable had happened. Martha was pregnant for the 4th time. The exhaustion was overwhelming. 4 pregnancies in less than 4 years, 3 young children she could barely see, constant work, demands, and now another child coming. Martha felt herself breaking in ways she hadn't allowed herself to feel before. She considered running. The forests around Cedar Hills were dense, and she had heard whispered stories of people who had escaped and made it north. But she had 3 children in the nursery. She couldn't take them with her. They were too young, would slow her down, would make escape impossible. She couldn't leave without them. The choice was impossible. So she made no choice at all. She simply continued day after day surviving. By late summer, Martha's pregnancy was obvious. Jonathan Whitfield noticed when she was serving dinner one evening and immediately summoned the head housekeeper to his study. Within a week, Jonathan had learned about Nathan's involvement. The confrontation was explosive. Servants throughout the house heard the shouting, Jonathan's voice like thunder, Nathan's voice defensive and dismissive. The argument ended with Nathan being sent to manage a timber operation in northern Mississippi, effectively exiled from Cedar Hills. But this time, Jonathan Whitfield made a different decision about Martha. Rather than selling her immediately, he kept her at Cedar Hills. Perhaps he recognized that selling her would acknowledge the problem publicly. Perhaps he calculated that she was valuable enough to keep despite the complications. Or perhaps he simply hadn't yet recognized the pattern that had followed Martha through 4 plantations. On November 7, 1844, Martha gave birth to her 4th child, a son. The birth was difficult. Martha hemorrhaged badly, losing enough blood that the midwife feared for her life. The plantation doctor was summoned, a rare expense for an enslaved woman's childbirth, and managed to stop the bleeding. But Martha spent 2 weeks in the infirmary recovering. The birth record noted November 7, 1844, male infant born to Mart. Household staff, difficult delivery. Mother suffered significant blood loss but survived with medical intervention. Child healthy. Weight approximately 6 lb. Father unknown. Medical costs $18 charged to plantation medical account. Martha named her son Joshua, meaning God is salvation, though she felt further from salvation than ever. During Martha's recovery in the infirmary, Cedar Hills made a decision about her older children. Sarah, now 3 1/2 years old, was deemed old enough to begin light work. She was moved from the nursery to the main house, where she would serve as a runner, carrying messages between buildings, bringing water to workers, learning the basic tasks that would prepare her for household service. Martha learned about this when she finally left the infirmary and found Sarah working in the kitchen house, her small hands washing vegetables under the supervision of the head cook. Sarah's face lit up when she saw her mother, but she wasn't allowed to stop working. They could only exchange looks, and Martha had to continue to her own assignment. Her heartbreaking. For the next 8 months, Martha lived in a kind of suspended state. She worked in the main house, saw Sarah occasionally during work, but could speak to her beyond brief exchanges, and visited Daniel and Rebecca in the nursery on Sundays. Now with baby Joshua as well, her body slowly recovered from the difficult birth, though she remained weaker than before. The accumulation of 4 pregnancies and constant labor taking its toll, she waited for the inevitable sale, expecting the trader to arrive any day. But months passed, and Jonathan Whitfield kept her at Cedar Hills. Martha began to cautiously hope that perhaps the pattern might be broken, that perhaps she might be allowed to remain in one place long enough to watch her children grow. Then, in August 1845, Vernon Hughes arrived at Cedar Hills. Not Vernon Hughes, the original trader who had transported Martha from Riverside, but Sheffield, another trader who worked similar routes. Jonathan Whitfield had decided that the complications outweighed the value, and it was time to cut his losses. The Cedar Hills Ledger recorded August 15, 1845, sale of Martha, age 24, with 4 children, ages 4 years, 3 months, 3 years, 2 months, 1 year, 9 months and 9 months, sold to Sheffield Trading Company MOBA. Sale price $550. Reason: reduction of household staff. Reassignment of assets. Proceeds applied to Estate Modernization Fund. Special notation: medical costs during recent pregnancy 18 deducted from final asset valuation. The price continued to fall. Martha was now worth less than a third of her original purchase price. Despite being only 24 years old and in the theoretical prime of her working life, her children, rather than adding value, had become liabilities in the calculations of plantation economics. Martha was given 2 hours to prepare. She gathered her 4 children, Sarah old enough to walk on her own, Daniel needing to be carried part of the time, Rebecca toddling but still unsteady, Joshua, a 9-month-old baby. She wrapped Joshua against her chest in a sling, held Rebecca's hand, and urged Sarah to stay close while she tried to manage Daniel. The logistics of moving one woman with 4 young children were complicated. Sheffield provided a wagon with room for everyone, and Martha climbed in with her small, devastating cargo. 4 children born in violence, carried in suffering, and now being moved again because their very existence was evidence of crimes that couldn't be acknowledged. As the wagon pulled away from Cedar Hills, Martha looked back at the plantation that had been her home. For 20 months, she saw the white column main house. She saw the nursery building, where her children had lived separated from her. She saw the servants' quarters, where she had slept in her tiny room alone while her children cried for her elsewhere on the property. 4 plantations, 4 pregnancies, 4 sales, and somehow, impossibly, Martha was still only 24 years old. One more plantation awaited her. The pattern was not finished, but Martha was. Sheffield's operation was based in Mobile, Alabama, a major port city that served as a hub for the domestic slave trade's western routes. Enslaved people were transported through Mobile to plantations throughout Alabama, Mississippi, and Louisiana, feeding the insatiable demand for labor in the expanding cotton and sugar regions. Martha and her 4 children spent 3 weeks in Mobile, held in a warehouse facility near the docks. The building was crowded with people awaiting sale, men purchased for field work, women for household service, children separated from parents, and sold for their future potential. The noise was constant, a mixture of crying, praying, and the harsh voices of the traders conducting their business. Sheffield recognized that Martha's situation was commercially complicated. 4 young children made her difficult to sell to most buyers. Her declining price history suggested she was problematic, but her literacy remained valuable, and some buyers specifically wanted enslaved families that could be presented as humanely managed to counter growing abolitionist criticism. Sheffield found his buyer in Louisiana, Henri Delacroix, a Creole planter whose family had owned Magnolia Grove for 3 generations. Delacroix was looking for an educated servant to assist with plantation correspondence and household management, and he was wealthy enough to absorb the cost of supporting 4 young children until they reached working age. The sale was negotiated through letters with Sheffield Painting. Martha as a valuable investment despite her family. Encumbrances. Delqua agreed to the purchase, and in late September 1845 Martha and her children were transported westward into Louisiana. The journey covered more than 200 meters through the coastal lands. A landscape unlike anything Martha had seen before. The land was flat and wet, cut through with bayou and swamps, thick with Spanish moss hanging from live oaks. The air smelled of mud and decay, and the particular sweetness of sugar cane. Magnolia Grove sat in Louisiana's sugar country, where the agricultural cycle was different and more dangerous than cotton. Sugar cultivation demanded precise timing, planting in the spring, cultivation through summer, and then the brutal harvest season from October through December, when the entire plantation worked 20-hour days to cut cane and process it before frost could destroy the crop. The grinding season was called the killing time because of the accidents in the mill, the exhaustion-related deaths, and the brutal pace that pushed workers past human limits. The Magnolia Grove records show September 28, 1845. Purchase of one female, Martha, age 24, with 4 children, ages 4 years, 5 months, 3 years, 4 months, 1 year, 11 months, and 10 months. Previous owner, Sheffield Trading via Cedar Hills Plantation, Alabama. Purchase price, $500. Skills, literacy, correspondence, household management. Assignment, main house, personal attendant to owner, children to be housed with mother in separate cabin. Special notation, family. Unit purchase, premium paid for documented literacy skills. Riaqua was 58 years old, a sophisticated man who had been educated in France and maintained connections to New Orleans' Creole society. He was a widower who had never remarried after his wife's death 15 years earlier. His 3 daughters were all married and living in New Orleans, leaving him alone at Magnolia Grove with a household staff of 12 enslaved servants and the 200 field workers who kept his sugar operation running. Unlike the other plantations, Delqua assigned Martha a small cabin near the main house where she could live with all 4 of her children. It was the first time since Cedar Hills that Martha had been allowed to keep her children with her, and the relief was overwhelming. Sarah, now 4.5, could finally sleep near her mother. Daniel, 3.5, and Rebecca, 2, could play nearby while Martha worked, and Joshua, 10 months old, could nurse whenever needed. The cabin was small, perhaps 10 feet by 12 feet, with a dirt floor, 1 window, and a fireplace, but it was theirs. And after the separations of Cedar Hills, Martha felt a cautious gratitude that she immediately distrusted. Experience had taught her that anything given could be taken away. Her work assignment was as Delqua's personal attendant, serving his meals, maintaining his private chambers, managing his correspondence, organizing his study, and assisting when he entertained guests, which was frequent, as Delqua was a social man who hosted dinners for neighboring planters and New Orleans businessmen. Delqua was a demanding employer, but not a violent one. He had exacting standards and expected perfection, but he didn't rage or strike his servants for minor failures. Instead, he used a system of small privileges and withdrawals, a slightly better food ration for good service, removal of Sunday privileges for poor work. It was a more subtle form of control than the whip, but control nonetheless. He was fascinated by Martha's literacy. He would have her read to him while he ate breakfast, passages from French novels, articles from New Orleans newspapers, correspondence from business associates. He would dictate letters while she wrote them in her careful script, sometimes testing her by using complex vocabulary or French phrases to see if she would falter when she sounded out the French words, not understanding them but able to replicate the sounds. He seemed bemused. "You have an unusual mind," he said once, watching her write. "It's a waste, really. In different circumstances, you might have been educated, accomplished, but circumstances are what that are." Martha said nothing. What could she say? The man who owned her body and her children was musing about how in some other world she might have been treated as human. The irony was too bitter for words. The relationship Delqua developed with Martha was different from what she had experienced at the other plantation. He didn't force himself on her with crude violence. Instead, he created a framework of implied consent that was just as coercive but more insidious. He offered small privileges, extra rations for her children, a better blanket for the cabin, fabric to make new clothes. He positioned these as gifts, as evidence of his benevolence, as rewards for good service. The unspoken understanding was clear. Accept these gifts, accept his attention, and life will be easier. Resist, and the gifts will disappear. The cabin will be taken away. The children will be separated and sent to the quarters. It wasn't a choice. It was coercion dressed up as generosity. By early 1846, Martha was pregnant for the 5th time. This pregnancy felt different, not physically, but psychologically. Martha recognized with perfect clarity that she was trapped in a pattern she couldn't break. 5 plantations, 5 pregnancies, 5 men who had taken what they wanted with no consequences. Her body was not her own. Her children were not her own. Even her literacy, the one skill that had seemed like an advantage, had become a trap, making her visible, making her valuable in ways that brought only suffering. She thought about the river that ran near Magnolia Grove, about walking into it with stones in her pockets, about escape through death if no other escape was possible. But then she would look at Sarah, now 5 years old and frighteningly intelligent, who had learned to read basic words by watching Martha write. She would look at Daniel, 4 years old, who tried so hard to be good, to not cry, to not be trouble. She would look at Rebecca, 2.5, who still smiled despite everything. She would look at Joshua, a toddler who didn't yet understand the world he'd been born into, and Martha would decide to survive one more day, not for herself. She was long past caring about her own survival, but for them, because if she was gone, who would protect them? Who would teach Sarah to read in secret? Give Daniel the embrace he desperately needed. Comfort Rebecca when she woke crying. Care for Joshua. So Martha survived, and the pregnancy continued. And in September 1846, she gave birth to her 5th child, daughter. The Magnolia Grove birth record noted, September 3, 1846, female infant born to Martha, personal attendant to H. Delacqua, healthy delivery, no complications, child weight approximately 7 lb, mother recovered well from delivery, father unknown, special notation, mother granted 2 weeks recovery period before resuming duties per H. Delacqua specific instruction. Martha named this daughter Grace, the only name she could think of that represented something she synced. Desperately wanted to believe in unearned favor, undeserved mercy, the possibility of something better than what was. And then something unexpected happened. Delacqua didn't sell Martha. Weeks passed, months passed. Martha waited for the trader to arrive, for the familiar pattern to unfold, for the sale that had followed every previous birth, but it didn't happen. For the first time, Martha remained at a plantation after giving birth. Through the rest of 1846, through all of 1847 through 1848, she worked, cared for her children, and existed in a state of constant vigilance, expecting every day to be the day when the sale would finally happen. Her children grew during those years at Magnolia Grove. Sarah turned 7, old enough to be put to work as a house servant, carrying messages and helping in the kitchen. Daniel, 6, was assigned to carry water to field workers during the harvest season. Rebecca, 5, was learning to sew under the supervision of an elderly woman who mended clothes. Joshua, 3, and baby Grace stayed in the cabin under the care of an older, enslaved woman who minded young children while their parents worked. For 2 years, Martha's life achieved a painful kind of stability. The work was hard. The circumstances were wrong in every fundamental way. But her children were with her. She could see them daily, feed them, teach them, protect them in the small ways that were possible within the constraints of slavery. Martha began to dare to hope, not for freedom, not for justice, but simply for this to continue, for the pattern to finally be broken, for Delacqua's decision to keep her to mean some small measure of permanence in her life. Then on October 14, 1848, Henri Decoy died. Suddenly, he was found in his study in the morning, collapsed at his desk, having suffered what the doctor determined was a massive heart condition. He was 58 years old. Decoy had 3 daughters, none of whom wanted to manage Magnolia Grove. The estate, including the plantation and all its property, was put up for auction to settle his debts and divide the proceeds among his heirs. The plantation auction was held on December 12, 1848. Buyers came from throughout Louisiana and Mississippi, examining the land, the equipment, the sugar processing facilities, and the 212 enslaved people who were part of the estate. Martha and her 5 children were sold as a family unit to a cotton broker from Mississippi for $475. The sale document recorded December 12, 1848, estate auction of Magnolia Grove Properties, Lot 47, one female Martha, age 28 with 5 children, ages 76,532. Skills, literacy, household management, correspondence. Sale price $475 to William Foster, Cotton Factor, Jackson, Mississippi. Special notation. Family. Unit price reflects significant dependent burden. $475. That was what Martha and her 5 children were worth after 8 years, 5 plantations, and 5 pregnancies, less than $60 each. As the wagon pulled away from Magnolia Grove on December 15, 1848, Martha looked back one final time. She was 28 years old. She had given birth to 5 children in 5 different plantations across 4 states. She had been sold 6 times. She had survived what should have broken her completely, and her story was about to disappear from the historical record. The pattern, it seemed, might continue beyond the 5 plantations, but Martha's documented journey ends here in 1848 as she and her children were transported into Mississippi and vanished from the ledgers that had tracked her for 8 years. What happened next would remain unknown for more than 160 years until a Preservation Society intern found those ledgers and started asking questions. The Preservation Society intern who discovered Martha's story in 2009 was named Rebecca Chen, a graduate student in history at the University of Georgia. She was working part-time with the Richmond County Historical Preservation Project, digitizing old courthouse records as part of her thesis research on antebellum property transactions. The work was mind-numbingly tedious, scanning page after page of faded handwriting, entering data into spreadsheets, creating indexes for records that had never been properly cataloged. Most of the documents were routine property deeds, tax records, marriage licenses, wills, but occasionally something would catch her attention. On a Tuesday afternoon in March, Rebecca was working through a box of plantation transfer logs from the 1840s when she noticed the name Martha appearing repeatedly across multiple documents from different plantations. The entries were spread across several years, but the details suggested they might be the same person. Age, literacy, presence of children. Rebecca began cross-referencing the documents, creating a timeline, and tracking the paper trail. What emerged was a pattern so methodical it seemed impossible to be coincidence. Riverside Plantation, Georgia. Martha purchased in April 1840 for $800. Birth record May 1841. 1 daughter. Sold June 1841 for $750 with 1 child. Fairmont Estate, Georgia. Martha purchased July 1841 for $650 with 1 child. Birth record June 1842. 1 son. Sold August 1842 for $700 with 2 children. Oakwood Plantation, Georgia. Martha purchased August 1842 for $625 with 2 children. Birth record September 1843, 1 daughter. Sold November 1843 for $650 with 3 children. Cedar Hills Plantation, Alabama. Martha purchased December 1843 for $600 with 3 children. Birth record November 1844, 1 son. Sold August 1845 for $550 with 4 children. Magnolia Grove, Louisiana. Martha purchased September 1845 for $500 with 4 children. Birth record September 1846, One daughter, sold December 1848 for few 175 seconds with 5 children, 5 plantations, 5 births, 5 sales. The mathematical precision was chilling. Rebecca brought the findings to her faculty advisor, Dr. James Morton, a historian specializing in slavery and the domestic slave trade. They spent 3 days verifying the documents, cross-referencing details, and confirming that all the entries referred to the same woman. "This is extraordinary," Dr. Morton said, examining the timeline Rebecca had created. "I've seen examples of enslaved women being moved after pregnancies, but I've never seen documentation of a pattern this systematic. This is evidence of something I've theorized about but never been able to prove definitively." They spent the next 2 years tracking down related documents across 4 states. They found birth records at each plantation documenting 5 children born between 1841 and 1846, each notation including the phrase "father unknown," a legal fiction that protected white men while condemning enslaved women. Transfer documents showing Martha's movement between plantations, each sale occurring within weeks or months of childbirth. Price records documenting Martha's systematic devaluation from $800 to $475 over 8 years despite being in the prime of her working life. Marginal notes in some ledgers describing Martha as problematic, unsuitable for standard assignment, require special management, coded language that blamed her for circumstances she had no power to control. Correspondence between planters and traders negotiating Martha's sales with language that made clear everyone involved understood what was happening, even if nobody would state it explicitly in official records. But perhaps most damning were the employment records they discovered. Dutch Carmichael, the overseer at Riverside, was dismissed 3 days before Martha was sold. His employment history showed he moved to South Carolina and was dismissed from 2 subsequent positions under similar circumstances. Edmund Beaumont of Fairmont Estate was removed from daily plantation management after Martha's pregnancy became known. He later moved west and appeared in court records in Missouri related to a paternity dispute with an enslaved woman. James Prescott of Oakwood was sent to manage a remote Prescott property in South Carolina. Family layers preserved in the Prescott family paper at the South Carolina Historical Society revealed tension between James and his father related to inappropriate conduct with household staff. Nathan Whitfield of Cedar Hills was exiled to Mississippi. Local newspapers from the 1850s include references to his drinking, gambling, and temperamental management style before he died in 1852 at age 29 from liver failure. Henry Dequa of Magnolia Grove was the exception. He died before Martha was sold, and his decision to keep her represented the only break in the pattern. The research revealed what the courthouse ledgers had documented but never stated explicitly. Martha was systematically moved between plantations to conceal the evidence of sexual violence committed by white overseers and owners' sons. Each pregnancy became a problem that was solved through sale. Each child was living proof of crimes that couldn't be prosecuted under law but could scandalize family. Yes, and damage reputations if acknowledged. Dr. Morton and Rebecca published their findings in the Journal of Southern History in 2011 in an article titled "Systematic Exploitation and Forced Migration, a Case Study in Antebellum Sexual Violence and Economic Devaluation." The article was later republished in Popular History magazines and became the basis for a museum exhibition about the hidden patterns in slave trade documentation. But their research also raised urgent questions. What happened to Martha after 1848? What happened to her 5 children? Rebecca Chen spent another 3 years searching for traces of Martha's children in historical records. The search was like detective work, piecing together fragments from auction records, plantation inventories, probate documents, and the rare manumission papers that documented enslaved people gaining freedom. The discoveries were heartbreaking. Sarah, Martha's oldest daughter, appeared in auction records from Jackson, Mississippi in August 1851. She was listed as female, age 10, literate, trained in household service. She was purchased separately from her mother and siblings by a plantation owner named Robert Clemens for $650. The notation emphasized her unusual, Literacy for someone so young. Sarah appeared again in the 1860 Clemens plantation inventory, listed as Sarah, age 19, household staff. Then she vanished from all records, whether she died, was sold again, or escaped during the Civil War chaos remained unknown. Daniel, the O.L. Dest son, appeared in a probate estate inventory from Natchez, Mississippi in 1853. The document listed him as Daniel, male, age 11, field worker, valued at $700 as part of an estate settlement. He had been separated from Martha and sold to a different owner. Rebecca found one more reference to someone who might be Daniel, a Daniel field hand, age 28, listed in an 1870 labor contract signed after emancipation with a plantation in Louisiana. If this was the same Daniel, he had survived slavery and remained in the South as a sharecropper, trapped in a system barely better than what he'd endured before. Rebecca, the middle daughter, disappeared from records entirely after the 1848 sale. Rebecca Chen, the researcher, found herself emotionally affected by the disappearance of her namesake, spending months searching through fragmentary documents trying to find any trace. The child Rebecca would have been only 5 years old in 1848, young enough that she might have been sold separately, might have died young, or might have survived into adulthood, but left no documentary trail. The researcher never found an answer. Joshua and Grace, the two youngest children, also vanished from the historical record after 1848. They would have been only 3 and 2 years old, respectively, when last documented. Children that young were sometimes kept with their mothers, but just as often were sold to plantations that wanted to raise enslaved children from youth to ensure a complete psychological conditioning to slavery. Without further documentation, their fates remained unknown. The systematic separation of Martha's children illustrated a brutal reality of the domestic slave trade. Families existed only at the owner's convenience. The 5 children Martha had carried, birthed, and loved were scattered across the South, separated from her and from each other, their connections to each other erased in the machinery of commerce. The search for Martha's own fate proved even more difficult after the December 1848 sale to William Foster Cotton Factory in Mississippi. The documentary trail went cold. Rebecca Chen searched through Mississippi plantation records from the 1850s, probate records that might show Martha in estate inventories, auction records that might show subsequent sales, manumission records that might show her gaining freedom, death records, though these were rarely kept for enslaved people, Civil War era contraband records documenting enslaved people who escaped, 2 Union lines, Freedmen's Bureau records from Reconstruction, post-war census records. The final confirmed reference appeared in a property transfer document from 1853 where Martha was sold, now 32 years old, to a plantation in eastern Texas for $275. The price had continued to fall, reflecting age, accumulated physical damage from years of hard labor and multiple pregnancies, and the permanent label of problematic that followed her through every transaction. After 1853, Martha disappeared from history. No death certificate, no manumission papers, no further sale records, no post-war documentation showing her alive. After emancipation, the most likely scenarios: 1. She died sometime in the 1850s. Her death unrecorded because enslaved people's deaths were rarely officially documented unless they affected property values. 2. She survived until emancipation in 1865 but left no documentary trail, like millions of formerly enslaved people who lived and died without official records, whose stories exist only in family memories passed down through generations. 3. She escaped or was freed during the Civil War chaos, when systems of documentation broke down and many enslaved people simply walked away from plantation. Dr. Morton and Rebecca published a follow-up article in 2014 titled Beyond the Ledgers: The Disappeared Lives of Enslaved Women. They argued that Martha's disappearance from historical records after 1853 was itself evidence of systemic erasure. Enslaved people were documented only when they had economic value to white owners, and when that value was exhausted, or when systems of documentation collapsed, their lives became historically invisible. The Article noted Martha survived at least 13 years of documented brutality, 5 forced pregnancies, 5 sales, and the separation from all 5 of her children. She was 32 years old when she last appeared in official records, still in the prime of her working life, but valued at less than a third of her original price. Whether she lived another 30 years or died within months of that final sale, we may never know. What we do know is that systems of slavery created and maintained this pattern of violence and then erased the evidence by reducing human lives to ledger entries that disappeared when they were no longer economically convenient. The courthouse ledgers that documented Martha's journey through 5 plantations are now preserved in climate-controlled archives at the University of Georgia and available through digital databases to researchers and descendants searching for family histories. The numbers tell their own brutal story. 8 years, the documented period of Martha's journey through 5 plantations, 1840. 1848, 5 plantations, Riverside, Georgia, Fairmont, Georgia, Oakwood, Georgia, Cedar Hills, Alabama, Magnolia Grove, Louisiana. 5 children born between 1841 and 1846, all eventually separated from their mother and from each other. 6 sales, the number of times Martha was sold as property, each sale following the same pattern, $800 to $275. The decline in Martha's value from first purchase to last documented sale, a 66% decrease over 13 years for men. Dutch Carmichael, Edmund Beaumont, James Prescott, Nathan Whitfield, all removed from their positions after Martha's pregnancies became known, all facing no legal consequences for their actions. Unknown, the word appearing 5 times in birth records, a legal fiction protecting perpetrators, 0 prosecution. The number of legal actions taken against any of the men who assaulted Martha, 160 plus years, the time between Martha's disappearance from records and the discovery of her story. The numbers represent the cold arithmetic of slavery, the reduction of human suffering to economic transactions, the systematic exploitation hidden in plain sight within official records, the evidence of crimes that were never prosecuted because the law didn't recognize enslaved women as victims capable of being wronged. But the numbers can't capture the full truth. They can't show how Martha felt holding each of her newborns, knowing what was coming. They can't show the terror of being sold and moved again and again, never able to establish any stability. They can't show the anguish of being separated from her children, knowing they would grow up without her protection. They can't show the psychological cost of enduring repeated violence with no recourse, no protection, no justice. The Preservation Society's work ensures that Martha's name, just her first name, the only one she was allowed to keep, is remembered. The digitized records are now used in university courses, museum exhibitions, and genealogy research. They stand as testimony to both the systematic cruelty of slavery and the extraordinary endurance of those who survived it. Dr. Morton, in his final published article on the case before his retirement, wrote, Martha's story is simultaneously unique and representative, unique in that we have such complete documentation of the pattern, representative in that countless enslaved women experienced similar trajectories that were never documented or have been lost to history. For every Martha whose journey we can trace through courthouse ledgers, there are thousands whose stories exist only in the spaces between official records, in family memories passed through generations or lost entirely to historical erasure. The courthouse ledgers will outlast us all. They sit in archives protected from decay, available to anyone who wants to understand what was done, who was complicit, and what it cost. They document the machinery of exploitation with perfect precision, every sale, every birth, every declining price point. But they'll never document the full truth of Martha's life. They'll never show her strength, her love for her children, her quiet resistance in continuing to exist, despite everything designed to break her. They'll never show the moments between the transactions, the lullabies she sang, the reading lessons she gave Sarah in secret, the ways she protected her children in the small ways possible, within impossible constraints. Martha was 19 when she arrived at the first plantation in 1840. She was 32 when she disappeared from the records in 1853. 13 documented years, 5 plantations, 5 children, 6 sales, and a pattern of systematic violence so methodical it could be tracked through courthouse ledgers more than 160 years later. The records revealed the truth, but the truth they revealed was only a fraction of the story. The rest, Martha's thoughts, her dreams, her quiet moments of resistance, her full humanity, exists beyond any ledger in the space where numbers end and human experience begins. That story was never written down, but it was lived and it mattered. And because of the work of researchers like Rebecca Chen and Dr. Morton, it will never be completely forgotten. The courthouse ledgers documented Martha's devaluation in dollars and cents, but they couldn't diminish her value as a human being, as a mother, as a survivor. That value was infinite, immeasurable, and beyond the reach of any system that tried to reduce human beings to property. Martha's story is not a comfortable one. It's not a story with a satisfying resolution or justice served. It is a story about systematic violence, about patterns of exploitation hidden in plain sight, about evidence preserved in the very record meant to legitimize the system that created such suffering. But it's also a story about survival, about endurance, about love that persisted despite everything, about humanity that couldn't be erased, even by systems designed to erase it. The ledgers preserved Martha's story. Now that story can finally be told, and in telling it we ensure that she and the millions like her are never forgotten. If this story moved you, if it made you think about the hidden patterns in historical documents and the lives they document, share it with someone who needs to understand this part of our history. Subscribe to our channel Buried Truths for more stories like this, and leave a comment sharing your thoughts. What do you think about Martha's story? How do we honor the memories of those whose full stories were never recorded?